Morning they read my grandfather's will. My uncle leaned over to my aunt and whispered something. She covered her mouth and laughed. I was sitting 6 feet away. I heard every word. He said, "This is going to be quick." I had driven 4 hours to be there. I was wearing the only suit I owned, a navy blue one I'd bought for a job interview 3 years earlier. The sleeves were slightly too short. I noticed my aunt noticing that. My grandfather had built everything from scratch, a trucking company he started with one vehicle and a commercial driver's license in 1979. By the time I was born, he had 43 trucks running routes across 7 states. He was the kind of man who remembered the name of every driver who ever worked for him. He kept a ledger, actual handwritten ledger books, going back to the beginning. I used to sit next to him at the kitchen table when I was young and watch him write in them. His handwriting was careful, and even like he believed that how you recorded something mattered as much as the thing itself. My mother was his only child. She died when I was 4. A car accident on a Tuesday morning. Ordinary weather. Nothing dramatic about the circumstances, except that she didn't come home. My grandfather drove 6 hours to get me. He put me in the back seat of his truck with a blanket and a sandwich, and he didn't say much the whole drive. But he kept looking at me in the rearview mirror. Not the way adults look at children to make sure they're still there. The way you look at someone you're making a promise to. I grew up in his house. His wife, my grandmother, made biscuits every Sunday morning and let me stay up past my bedtime to watch baseball with my grandfather. She died my sophomore year of high school. After that, it was just the two of us, and the house felt quieter, but not empty. He wasn't the kind of man who filled silence with noise. He taught me that silence could be respectful, that you didn't have to say everything you were thinking to mean it. My uncle came into the picture when I was around 7. He had married my grandfather's niece, so technically he wasn't blood, but he had a talent for making himself feel essential. He would show up for holidays with expensive bottles of wine my grandfather never drank and talk loudly about the business like he understood it. He didn't work there. He had some kind of consulting arrangement that my grandfather had set up years ago, mostly, I think, to make peace with the family side that always felt overlooked. My uncle had 2 daughters. They were fine. They came to Thanksgiving sometimes and talked mostly to each other. When my grandfather got sick, things shifted. He'd been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's about 2 years before he died. He was still sharp. His hand shook sometimes when he poured coffee, but he knew exactly what was happening in every corner of that business. He promoted his operations manager, a man named Gus, who had been with the company for 20 years, and he started transitioning more of the day-to-day. He also started spending more time just sitting with me, talking. Not about business, about my mother, about what she was like when she was young, about the decisions he'd made that he was proud of, and the ones he wasn't. I moved back in with him during his last year. I worked remotely, a drafting job I'd had since finishing my associate's degree in engineering technology, and I handled the things he couldn't manage himself anymore, doctor's appointments, medications, making sure he ate. He didn't like asking for help, but he let me give it without making either of us feel bad about it. That's how he was. My uncle started calling more frequently that year. He had questions about the business structure, about the pension arrangements, about whether my grandfather had updated his estate documents. My grandfather would hang up and look at the phone for a second before setting it down. One evening, he told me, "Your uncle is a man who counts things that aren't his yet." I didn't say anything. He looked out the window. "I've already handled it," he said. That was all. My grandfather died on a Wednesday in March. Quietly, the way he had lived. I was in the house. I had made coffee that morning and brought it to his room, and he had thanked me, and by afternoon he was gone. The reading of the will was scheduled for a Friday 3 weeks later. It was held at the office of his attorney, a woman named Ms. Trevelyan, who had handled his legal work for over 2 decades. The office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, modest, the kind of place that communicated seriousness without trying to impress anyone. There were 6 of us in the room. Miss Trevelyan, her paralegal, my uncle, his wife, his oldest daughter, who had driven in from out of state, and me. My uncle had brought coffee from somewhere in a cardboard carrier. He offered me a cup. I took it. His daughter smiled at me the way people smile when they're trying to seem gracious about something they've already decided. Ms. Mean Trevelyan opened the folder in front of her and set her reading glasses on. My uncle leaned back in his chair like a man who has already heard the story and is just waiting for the part where he gets mentioned. She began reading. The house went to me. The personal accounts went to me. The personal accounts went to me. A separate, smaller account had been designated for charitable donation to a scholarship fund my grandfather had set up years ago at the local community college, one that supported students going into trades. And the company, all 43 trucks, all operating contracts, the real estate holdings tied to the business, the whole thing, went to me. The room was very quiet. My uncle set down his coffee cup. He started. Miss Trevelyan looked at him over her glasses. He stopped. Ms. Trevelyan looked at him over her glasses. He stopped. There's also a letter, she said. Your grandfather asked that it be read aloud in the event that any party chose to contest the will. She paused. I'm going to read it now regardless. She unfolded a single page. The handwriting was his. I recognized it immediately. He had written it 14 months before he died. He said that he'd been thoughtful about this, that he had not made these decisions out of sentiment or in a state of diminished capacity, but with full clarity and intention. He explained that he had spent considerable time with his attorney, reviewing the legal standards for a valid will, and that he had also met, separately, with 2 physicians who had each provided written assessments of his cognitive function. Those assessments were attached to the estate file. He said that he understood this would be a surprise to some people. He said he had watched over many years who showed up and who didn't. He was not angry about it. He said he had made peace with understanding that different people are capable of different things. But he had also spent his life building something, and he believed that what you build should go to the people who understood what it cost. He said that I had moved back into his house without being asked, that I had driven him to chemotherapy appointments and waited in the parking lot and never once made him feel like a burden, that I had sat with him through the nights when the tremors were bad and talked to him about baseball and about the company and about my mother, and that those conversations had given him something he hadn't known he still needed. He said, I know what some of you are thinking right now. I want you to know that I thought about this longer than you have. My uncle's jaw was tight. Miss Trevelyan folded the letter. Mr. Aldrich has 45 days to review the documents, she said, addressing my uncle directly. However, I want to be transparent. The estate was structured with explicit attention to contestability. The cognitive assessments are in order. The signing was witnessed by 2 individuals unaffiliated with the family. And there is an additional sealed document that is to be released to the court should a contest be filed. My uncle said, What additional document? I'm not able to share the contents. Only that it exists and is in our custody. He looked at his wife. She looked at her hands. His daughter excused herself to use the restroom. I sat there with the coffee cup in my hands, and I remember thinking that it had gotten cold. I remember thinking that the chair I was sitting in was slightly uncomfortable, that the fabric on the armrest was rough, and that outside the window behind Miss Trevelyan there was a parking garage, and beyond that a strip of sky and a water tower. I remember thinking about how my grandfather had looked in a rearview mirror when I was 4 years old, that particular kind of looking, and I thought he knew even then. My uncle filed the contest 31 days later. The grounds were undue influence. His attorney, a man named Hargrove who wore cufflinks, and spoke in a tone that suggested he found most people beneath him, argued that I had isolated my grandfather from the rest of the family during his illness, that I had positioned myself as a caretaker in order to exert influence over an elderly man in a vulnerable state, that the will did not reflect my grandfather's true wishes, but rather the result of sustained manipulation by a young man with access and opportunity. I sat at the defendant's table and I listened to this. I had my own attorney, a woman my grandfather had told me to call if anything like this ever happened. Her name was Ms. Forsyth. She was small and quiet, and she took notes in a legal pad with a blue pen, and she had a way of waiting for the other side to finish speaking before she said anything, like she was letting the weight of what they'd said settle in the room. Hargrove called my uncle to the stand. My uncle talked about how close he had been with my grandfather, how he had tried to visit but I had discouraged it, how he'd called and found the calls going longer and longer without being returned. He spoke with genuine-sounding sadness. He was good at it. I watched the judge. His name was Judge Whitmore, older man, silver hair, the kind of face that doesn't give much away. Hargrove showed records of a 4-month period during my grandfather's last year when calls to my uncle's number had gone unreturned for weeks at a time. He suggested this was evidence of isolation. He said with great emphasis that my grandfather had been in a vulnerable state and that I had been his sole point of contact with the outside world. Miss Forsyth waited until he was finished. Then she stood up. She had my grandfather's calendar, the actual physical calendar he kept on the kitchen wall, the kind with large squares for each day where he wrote appointments in his careful handwriting. She had taken photographs of every page from the last 18 months of his life. She presented them to the court. Doctor's appointments, business calls, 2 dinners with his old friend Harold. Wait, not Harold. With a man named Bert, his oldest friend from the trucking days, who he had dinner with on the first Thursday of every month, until he was too sick to go out. An afternoon at a local museum with his neighbor's grandkids, a call with his attorney, a call with his accountant. She asked my uncle under oath when the last time was that he had visited. He said he had been busy. She asked him to be specific. He said it had been, he thought, maybe 8 months before the death. She asked him to look at the calendar for that month. He looked. There was no record of a visit. She asked him if it was possible it had been longer. He said he didn't remember exactly. She showed him phone records, the unanswered calls he had cited as evidence of my isolation campaign. 17 calls over 4 months. She then showed the records from the prior year, 6 calls total. The year before that, 4, she said quietly. Your pattern of contact did not change during the time my client served as caregiver. It had been minimal for years. Hargrove objected. The judge overruled him. Then Miss Forsyth asked to submit the sealed document my grandfather had left with his estate file. The room shifted. I could feel it. Hargrove sat up straighter. Judge Whitmore reviewed the document privately first, as the filing had specified. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he set it down and looked at the room with an expression I hadn't seen from him yet in the proceedings. Not exactly emotion, more like recognition, like a man who has been told something he had already suspected. The document was a personal accounting my grandfather had kept, starting from the year I came to live with him. It wasn't a financial record, though. There were numbers in it. It was more like a log. He had written down in his careful, even handwriting the significant events of my life and his. My first day of school, my grandmother's funeral, the night I called him from a gas station at 2 in the morning because I had a flat tire and no money, and he had driven 40 minutes to meet me, my high school graduation, the year I dropped out of a 4-year program because I couldn't afford it and he hadn't known, and when he found out he had set up a small account to help me finish something, anything, which was how I had gotten the associate's degree. He had also written down the significant absences, not with bitterness, just as fact. Thanksgiving the year my grandmother died, my uncle had sent a card. Christmas the year my grandfather had a minor cardiac event and spent 3 days in the hospital. My uncle had called once, briefly, and asked if there was anything he could do. There was. There were many specific things. None of them were done. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before my grandfather died. He had written about a morning we spent together on the back porch. He wrote that the coffee was good and that the light came through the oak tree a particular way, and that we had talked about his company and what I might do with it, and that he felt, he used this word, settled. He wrote, "He has never asked me for anything except my time. That is not manipulation. That is love." Judge Whitmore read one passage aloud to the courtroom. Then he looked at Hargrove, then at my uncle. He said, "I'm going to be direct. The evidence before this court does not support the claim of undue influence. What it supports in considerable detail is the portrait of a man who made a deliberate, documented, and legally sound decision about the disposition of his estate. The petition is denied." My uncle stood up. He started to say something. His attorney put a hand on his arm. He stopped. The room emptied around me slowly. I stayed in my seat for a moment. The overhead lights in that courtroom had a faint hum to them. I'd been listening to it for 2 days and hadn't consciously registered it until the voices stopped, and the only thing left was the hum and the sound of Ms. Forsyth clicking her pen closed. She looked at me and said, "He was thorough." I said, "He always was." I drove home after, not to the house I'd been renting. I had moved back into my grandfather's house after he died, just to keep things in order, and somewhere in the past few months it had stopped feeling temporary. I made coffee in his kitchen. I sat at the table where I used to watch him write in his ledger books. The evening light came in at an angle through the window above the sink, the same window I had looked out of 1,000 times since I was 4 years old. The trucking company had 43 trucks. I knew the name of every route. I knew which drivers had seniority and which terminals needed attention and what my grandfather had been planning to do about a contract renewal in the spring. He had told me, not because he was grooming me, because we talked. Because when you spend that much time with someone, you absorb what they know the way you absorb the way they take their coffee or the particular silence they settle into when they're thinking something through. I called Gus that evening. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your grandfather told me this might come. He said if it did, you'd handle it right." I asked him when he had said that. He said about 14 months ago. I looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, the faint ring left by a coffee cup years before that my grandmother had always meant to sand out and never gotten around to. My grandfather had never gotten around to it either. I had looked at that ring my whole life. I said, "Let's meet next week. I want to go over everything." Gus said, "I'll bring the ledgers." That night I went out to the back porch. The oak tree was there, same as always, and the light was gone, but the sky still held some color at the edges. I thought about what my grandfather had written, that the light came through the oak tree a particular way, that he had felt settled. I understood what he meant. Not the word exactly, but the feeling underneath it. The feeling of having done what you were supposed to do and knowing it, not because someone told you, but because you could look back and find it in every small, ordinary choice you had made over many years, without an audience, without recognition, just because it was the right thing and because the person sitting next to you was worth it. He had known that I would carry it, not the company specifically, though that too, but the thing underneath it, the idea that how you show up for someone, quietly, without keeping score, without an exit strategy, is the only currency that actually holds its value when everything else is contested. I stayed out there until the sky went dark. Then I went inside and washed the coffee cups and turned off the kitchen light. There's a coffee ring on my grandfather's kitchen table that nobody ever sanded out. I've looked at it my whole life. For a long time, I thought it was just one of those things people mean to fix and never get around to. I think it might be the truest thing in the house. Proof that someone sat here, drank something hot, stayed a while. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the courtroom. Not the verdict. Not my uncle's face when Ms. Forsyth finished reading. I keep coming back to the table and the ring and the 14 months my grandfather spent quietly writing down what he saw. He didn't have to do that. He could have made his decisions and left it at that. But he understood something I was still learning. That integrity isn't just about what you do. It's about whether you can account for it. Whether if someone asked you to justify every choice going back 20 years, you could sit down and do it honestly, without flinching. He kept that record because he lived in a way that could withstand scrutiny. That's not luck. That's character built slowly, over time, out of choices nobody was watching him make. I think about what Hargrove said in that courtroom. That I had isolated my grandfather. That I had positioned myself. Those words were chosen to make care look like strategy. And for a moment, I won't pretend otherwise. They landed. Because that's what happens when you've spent years doing something without keeping score. You don't have a ready argument. You just have the truth, and the truth isn't always loud. But my grandfather was smarter than that. He understood that the truth needed to be legible, so he wrote it down. Not to protect himself. He was already gone. To protect what was real. That's a kind of wisdom I didn't fully appreciate until I read his words in that courtroom, in his handwriting, in sentences he had constructed the same careful way he ran his business, precisely, without waste, with full knowledge of what he was doing and why. And I think about what it cost him to build what he built. Not the money, the decades of showing up before anyone else did, of honoring commitments when it would have been easier not to, of treating people with consistency even when they didn't deserve it. That kind of steadiness doesn't come from talent. It comes from deciding over and over that you're going to do the hard thing anyway. My grandfather did that his whole life. He also taught me to do it, not through lectures, but through example. Through the way he looked at problems, through the way he never complained about difficulty, just moved through it. I didn't fight for that inheritance because I wanted the money. I fought because walking away would have meant letting a lie stand, and I had watched my grandfather his whole life refuse to let lies stand, quietly, without drama, just by being accurate about things. I owed him that much. What I've come to understand is that cause and consequence are slower than we expect. The years I spent showing up, driving to appointments, staying up late, talking about baseball when that was all we could do, those years didn't feel like an investment. They felt like the right thing. The consequence came later, in a sealed envelope, in a handwriting I would recognize anywhere. You cannot manufacture that. You can only earn it, the long way, the only way it actually works. Gus is bringing the ledgers next week. I'm going to learn everything my grandfather built, from the first truck to the last contract, the same way he taught me everything else, one honest entry at a time.